So in this video, I'm going to be changing the tires, which involves lifting up the bike, removing them, and doing a number of steps. I'm going to be jumping right in and showing each step as I go along, the tools I use, any considerations, and at the end of this video I will compile a list so that you can review all of the parts I use and any steps that are needed. So you can start with the front wheel or the rear. I'm going to be starting with the rear, so get that booty up in the air. I got a pair of stands, one for the front and the rear, but your bike might have a center stand. You might be able to use a jack, whatever works. Just, get the weight up off the wheel so you can remove them. So this is the rear axle nut, obviously. They come in a number of sizes. I leave it up to you to check your manual or look online for whatever size your bike has. Another consideration is some of them have pins like mine here. Some don't, but it should be pretty obvious if there's a pin. So you're going to be needing to remove the pin first and then going on to the nut. So these tires are 10 years old, so this nut likely hasn't been removed in a decade. So this is going to be a battle of the brawn. So I'm going to get some WD-40 in there. So I don't have an impact driver, but I do have a mallet, and that's basically the same thing, right? So I've been trying to get this off for like 5-10 minutes, and so I busted out the hammer, and it's finally started to budge. All you need is a hammer. So once you've got it loosened and removed, you will be needing a hammer and or mallet anyway, or some kind of device you don't mind getting banged up as you try and whack out the axle here. You banged out the axle on the other side, it's popped out this one, and you'll grab onto it and start wiggling it every which way, pulling it out. You might have to lift up the wheel to loosen it, but basically you're just doing a bunch of wiggling right now as you pull out the axle. I needed both my hands there, but as soon as you've got the axle out, it'll be coming through here, and just try and wiggle the brake off to the side. Then you'll wiggle the chain off of the sprocket, and if you're doing it above dirt like I am, I recommend just trying to put it off onto the side of the swing arm so you're not dragging your chain through dirt there. To remove the front wheel, you'll start by removing both brake calipers. In my case, mine has 2 Allen key screws. I'll remove this on both sides and take them off. Now with the screws loosened, you'll just keep wiggling it until you get it off the disc. Boom, there you go. So now that the brake calipers are removed, just leave them off to the side there, and you'll notice that one side of the axle has a flat surface or a lack of edging so that it doesn't look like you can use a tool with it. And then the other side will have either an inverted hex socket like this or a bolt sticking out. Either way, again, I leave it to your discretion what size and what tool you need. In my case, I need the inverted hex here. What you'll be doing next is loosening the pinch bolts here, which I've already done. You'll loosen both of them, and then you'll loosen the axle. And once more, if you don't have an impact driver, good old mallet. Now that the wheels are off, I've brought them inside to save myself from the heat and mosquitoes. To start off with, I'll be using the core removal tool, and you'll put it in here, unscrew it, and if there's any air in it, should it not be flat, then it'll let out all the air, and I'll show you the next step. So next step is to pet your kitty. Now that all the air has been let out of the tire, you'll take your bead breaker and get that between the tire and the rim. It'll take some wiggling and get it in there. You'll take your second piece, put it down into the slot, and then closing them together, you'll pry it away like that, and you'll have to do it in a few spots to really get it going. But once you do break the bead in a section, you can just use your hand to push it down all around the rest. So now that the bead's broken on both sides of the wheel, I recommend using rim protectors, rim shields, so that you're not scratching the outside of your rim here. So you'll take the other end, push it down in between the rim guard and the tire, and you'll pry it. You'll keep prying it until the tire actually comes over the top of the rim here. And you might have to do it in a couple sections at the same time, so your one hand is prying here, another hand is prying here, but you'll just keep going and it'll be evident when the tire actually comes off. So I only had to do it once. I put the rim guard down, used the tool to lift the tire over, and then once I did that, I was able to maneuver the rest of it off with just my hand. So I've gotten the tire all the way off on one side. I've put the rim protector on said side, putting the tool through, and so now I'll be lifting this side off by prying it over the edge. Once I got the breaker on that side on top of the rim guard, I popped it off, and I didn't get very far with that, but just put your weight down on it. Just keep wiggling the bar and weight, more weight, and eventually it'll separate. And boom. What I did was take some paper towel and alcohol, and I wiped down the inside of the rim. I mean all over, but with a focus on where the bead will be sitting, so that any dirt and grime and anything left over there is cleaned up, so that the new tire will have a proper contact between the bead and the metal. So now that you've got the new tire on, you're going to notice that some of the bead hasn't quite seated on the shoulder. So at that point you're going to try and fill it up with some air and see if it can't reseat itself just with some pressure. Don't go over about 40 psi or so, maybe 45, but if it hasn't reseated by then, there's something else going on, and try reseating it yourself with your bead breakers. Comment I wanted to make is that while you're doing the tire replacement, prying the old one off, putting the new one on, don't put any significant amount of weight down on the rim if you've still got your rotors on, because you can bend them doing that. So if you are going to be leaning on it to try and hold it down, I recommend taking them off, and in addition to that, it gives you the benefit of that much more room to get your bead breakers in there. So on the subject of not putting weight on the rotors themselves, obviously the rear has a rotor and a sprocket. I recommend just popping the sprocket off on that side and leaning the wheel on this side while you do the tire change, and that way you're not putting undue weight on anything critical. So, got the rear off the rim, and now I know why it's flat.
Well, there's your problem.
So, 10 years old plus a screw in it. Yep, or nail. Definitely time to change it.
You're next.
So once more, I'll be using ethanol and some paper towel to wipe down the inside of the rim with a focus on the shoulder here, so that the bead will have a better contact with the metal. Congratulations making it this far. I'm really proud of you. With the rim cleaned up now, you'll be putting the new tire on in the same way that you put the first one back on, and after that it'll be time to put it back on the bike. But only after you pet your kitty. And only after you hit up your poison of choice. I mean, after all, you deserve it for doing all this. Couple of points. Remember that you have to point the arrow in the direction that the wheel will be spinning. In my case, I've got the brake on the right side and the sprocket and chain on the left side, meaning that it'll be spinning this way. So once more, make sure the tire is matched to that. As a reminder, remember to get the dot lined up with the valve as well. Just kidding. One more thing before you put it up on the bike, and that's to balance the wheel itself. So putting it on your balance stand, you'll spin the wheel, and then it'll either settle out, or as you can see here, it's reversing as the heaviest part of the wheel sinks to the bottom. So just about there is where the lightest spot is up at the top. Now is when you start putting weights on the rim up at the top there. And then you give the wheel a spin, see if it does the same thing, keep adding weights, and then as soon as it gets to a spot where it spins and then settles, spins and then settles, that's where your wheel's balanced. But should a heavy part keep sinking to the bottom, you want to keep adding weights until that stops. One thing I wanted to mention is when you're ready to put the weights on, I'd recommend cleaning the spot you're going to adhere it to with some alcohol and paper towel, just to make sure that the adhesive is actually getting on cleaned rim and not dirt and little particles, oil, what have you. So I have cleaned off a section, as you can see here. It's contrasting with all the other goop here, and these are the weights themselves. And now, if you watch me spin the wheel, wherever it lands, it'll pretty well settle out. The good way to balance your tires too is put your cat on, and if it keeps rolling, then it's not balanced enough, so just keep putting your cat back and forth until it settles out. A little bit back in there. Try again. So, really good. Even though it doesn't swing all the way back, it sometimes. It doesn't have to be perfect, but as long as it doesn't swing back all the way around. If for the most part it settles where it stops, then you're good to go. Now that the new tires are on the rim, it's time to put them back on the bike. For the front wheel, it's pretty simple. You just got to put it in between the forks and then work the axle back in as you did when you disassembled it. As a reminder, make sure that the arrow on your tire itself is pointed in the direction that the bike is going to be rolling. And I also recommend getting some automotive grease. This is some white lithium, and grease up your axle like any good bottom. So grease up your axle, and that'll help get it in more easily. So greasing up everything in there, I've used a mallet to bang the axle back in as far as I can without digging into the threads on the other side. It's time to screw it back in with your wrench or whatever you prefer. And when it starts to get tight, that's when you're going to break out the torque wrench and tighten it to the specs specified in your manual. The wheel is now reinstalled. The axle is torqued to the specs needed. Now it's time to reinstall your brake calipers. So as before, you had to wiggle them off. This time you're going to wiggle them on and reattach them. Now with the calipers reinstalled on either side of the wheel, you're going to be tightening the pinch bolts to actually hold the axle in place. So I won't show me using the torque wrench, but mine, for example, here are 16 foot-pounds, so you really don't need a lot of force. Oh yeah, baby, front wheel done. So I got the new shoes on there, brake calipers are done, axles in to spec, did the pinch bolts, and if you had to loosen the cover here, remember to put the bolts back in for that. Now moving on to the rear wheel, you'll have your axle, and make sure again that your chain adjustment block is on it before you start reinserting it into the swing arms, so that you don't miss that and have to take it all the way back out. So again, make sure that if you had any extra parts too, that they're going back in the same order that you took them out. Once you're ready for reassembly, don't forget to lube up your axle like a hooker. You really can't have too much grease in there. So, got the rear wheel reassembled. Basically just put it back together the same way you took it apart. Again, I recommend taking pictures, video, whatever you have to. Write down notes so you can do that. Got all the bearings greased up, the axle nuts re-torqued to spec, and one other consideration is the chain tension. Different bikes call for different things. My manual says to do the chain tension adjustment on the side stand, so I did that. It's within spec now. I'll do a once over just to make sure I didn't miss anything of bolts, any retorquing, whatever else. And now that the bike's on the ground, I'll be upping the air pressure in the tires to what the manual calls for. So one thing I didn't mention at the time about lubing up your axle and bearings, and that you don't actually have to grease your axle. There isn't any movement on the axle itself. I do that to make it easier to get in and out. But the focus should be the bearings, whether it's the bearing in the sprocket, the bearing on the other side there, whatever. That's where your focus should be, where there's actually metal on metal contact of spinning. But the axle itself doesn't need it. It just makes things easier.